welcome to another webcast of A Mirror Darkly. Today's topic is heresy.
And I have new hair, you see.
Okay, I was going to say that people will probably wonder how it's going to be any different than it normally is.
Oh.
Anyway, question that you may have, I mean, it's a word that gets tossed around a lot, what, heresy, you're a heretic, whatever. What actually is heresy? How do we go
No
about
idea,
defining it?
but my phone is noisy.
Yes, it is. It always is. Harold O.J. Brown wrote a book a few years ago called Heresies. There you go. And it's available on Amazon. It was originally published in 1988. The copy I have was a reprint by Hendrickson in 1998, and Hendrickson reprinted it again in 2015. So you can get copies of it if you want, except the copies that they have now are paperback.
Oh.
So, oh well. Anyway.
Could you get on the Kindle?
I did not check on that.
Oh.
One would suspect one could, but I don't know for sure.
Researching.
Yes, see if it's available on Kindle, which would be the cheapest. I mean, the paperback, I mean, you can get copies of the hardback, but they're used and they're expensive. They're like $47. The paperback's unusually expensive too. It's like $27. So I don't know what that's all about.
Well, and the Kindle version's way lighter too.
Yeah, that's true. It wouldn't weigh as much. Hendrickson is normally cheap, so I don't know what the deal is. Because Hendrickson normally is a publisher that republishes other things.
What's his last name?
Oh, his name is Brown.
Oh, Harold Brown?
Harold O.J. Brown.
Okay. Paperback, hardcover. Nope.
What happens if you click on the paperback one? Does it list any other alternative formats? Yeah,
Nope, hardcover and paperback.
Oh, there's 34.47 for a hardback. That's going to be a used one.
The paperback is prime.
Yes.
But I guess you could have it on your Kindle if you laid your phone down and put the book on top of
the
it.
Kindle,
Yeah.
but that would be silly.
Yes.
Anyway.
I'm super helpful.
Yes, you are. Brown's argument in his book is that Christian theology is largely is in large part a history of heresies. Because of Jesus and the claims he made, because they seem incredible, the history of theology is the history of succeeding generations of Christians through almost 20 centuries trying to understand, trust, and obey Jesus Christ. And theology, particularly orthodoxy, is reacting usually against heresy. That is, heretics come up with some weird notion, everybody else goes, ew, and then they more carefully formulate what it is that they believe that's considered proper versus what's considered weird. The focus of heresy is generally speaking on just the doctrine of God and the doctrine of Christ, because those are the critical points.
Okay.
And so, for instance, if you've ever studied theology at all, you'll run across a definition for the Trinity. Mm-hmm. And the definition for the Trinity is this very long, cumbersome, complex thing. The reason it's as long and cumbersome and as complex as it is because it's trying to exclude all the heretical notions.
Okay.
And that's kind of been the nature of theology in general. When you get really carefully crafted definitions of things, the reason for that is because of heresy. Now, heresy and theology, for that matter, didn't really start to come into their own until probably in the 2nd, 3rd centuries A.D. It is up until then, Christians were too busy avoiding being eaten by lions to concern themselves a great deal with details of doctrine, although there were some heretical notions even at the very beginning. You see that reflected in the writings of John and Paul, where Paul's reacting against those of the circumcision group who insisted that you had to become circumcised in order to become a Christian. That was perhaps the earliest of the doctrinal controversies that we see in the church. You see it in the book of Acts, and then you see Paul dealing with it in his letters.
So what is the definition of heresy? You might have said it, and I was saying hi to somebody.
Heresy is, the word itself, as I recall, goes back to a word in Greek that just means a sect.
Okay.
But it took on a negative connotation in the sense that someone who has an aberrant view of the basic concepts of Christianity,
Okay.
primarily associated with God or Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for instance, those that deny the Trinity would be classified as heretics.
Okay.
So, for instance, Jehovah's Witnesses are heretics because they deny that the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are all God. Because
Okay.
they deny the deity of Jesus, they deny the deity of the personhood of the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
And so that puts them into the realm of what
So
we
it's
classify as heresy.
So it is basically an idea that goes against like more widely held beliefs about Jesus or God.
Yeah.
So if I came up with an idea that God walks around with the purple umbrella, that this would probably be a heretical idea.
No, it'd just be weird.
Okay, just weird.
Because it has no impact on
Okay.
his personhood.
Oh, okay.
Maybe his fashion sense, but not his
Hey,
personhood.
purple's a really pretty
Purple's
color.
fine, but why would you be wandering around with purple?
So it
umbrella?
has to be something that really
It has to be something that really has an impact on the actual nature of God. And
So if you came up with an idea that God is, say, not all powerful.
yeah, then that
Okay,
might run
that would be a
into,
heretical
that might run into
idea.
heresy,
Okay.
depending on where you take it and what you do with it. Heresy, though, from the standpoint of your average person, your average Christian, it gets tossed around rather freely. That is, heresy in popular notion tends to be used for anything that people disagree with.
Right.
That is, you have a different viewpoint on baptism than I do, and so therefore you're a heretic.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, that has often been the case, where you have a different viewpoint on what communion symbolizes.
Mm-hmm.
That is the blood and bread actually turned into the body, and the wine and the bread is actually turned into the body and blood of Jesus. Some churches would say yes, others would say no, and over that issue, people have actually killed one another.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get to that in a little bit of detail as to why it results in that and the problems with it. You have differences on, well, for instance, relatively minor points. It used to be the case, it's not the case now, that monophysitism was considered a heresy. Now, you probably have
Okay.
never heard of monophysitism.
Mono means one. Fit.
Nature.
Oh, okay.
That
Fit
is
as in
the
physically
question.
fit or.
Or not. Yeah. That is Jesus two natures or one nature? Is he both human and divine as separate things or as one thing?
Okay.
And so the Syrian Orthodox Christianity, for instance, is monophysite. That is, they believe that he has one nature, that is, the two natures become one and you can't really separate them out. And from a practical standpoint, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
It's kind of like the question that people have regarding Jesus being tempted. Could he have sinned? And so you could say, well, he could have, but he didn't, or he couldn't have and didn't. From a practical standpoint, it doesn't really change
Because he just
anything.
didn't.
It's
That's
because he
the
didn't.
fact of the matter.
But people will really get upset with one another over issues like that. That's why
It's-
sometimes people make comments about theology that it's arguments over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It is, it's arguments over things that don't matter and have no impact on anything.
It's a good thought experiment.
It's a good thought experiment, but see, theology is more than that. One of the problems that people have with theology, and part of the reason we have the subtitle for this webcast is Unbridled Inquiry, is that you will have people that imagine that theology is all set in stone, that we have all the answers and these are what they are and you simply memorize them. A certain institution I taught at briefly for 1 year, that was essentially the way they approached theology.
And that's how I was raised.
Right. It is, here are the answers, you will memorize them, and then you will know theology. And quite frankly, that's really not what theology is all about. And as the title of the webcast is, A Mirror Darkly, Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that we see through a mirror darkly, we know in part. It is, we don't know everything. And quite frankly, theology's most important aspect of theology is the questions. That is,
Well,
you
the
don't have
ology part means study.
Yeah, it means study, so you should have...
And it's not study to memorize, it's study in the sense of investigation.
Right.
And if God wanted us to know all those answers, he would have said, okay, this is me.
Yes.
He would have had his Facebook profile complete.
Yes. Also, despite the popularity of catechisms, which are questions and answers that new converts are supposed to memorize all the answers so they can get the right ones, the Bible's not set up like that.
Right.
It's a useful technique sometimes for teaching basic ideas, but there's a lot more than the basics.
Right. Well, it's like the difference between learning your alphabet and studying like the etymology of words.
Right.
So there is a place for memorization and for learning those
Certainly.
rote things, but then when you're looking at where does this word come from, you have to look back at the history of it, and you have to kind of tease out meanings and things like that, and how is the word used now and things like that.
Yeah,
so.
well, it's like with math, is you teach children very early on, they memorize the numbers, you teach them times tables, there's a lot of memory work involved. Same thing with the beginnings of learning, say, geometry. There's a lot of memorization of proofs and theorems and all of that sort of thing. Once you've got all those basics down, math becomes very much not memorization.
Right.
And the focus of mathematics is on a lot of questions and trying to figure out, well, how do we know for sure that this is the way it works?
And the reason we've developed things like abacuses and calculators and computers is to take the
drudgery out of it.
drudgery of the adding and subtracting, having to do this all the time and take your shoes off to borrow.
So that you can focus on the
so
big
you
questions
can, right.
of math. Yeah.
Plus, if you don't carry the one, it can really screw up your
Exactly.
research.
Yeah, you don't want to screw up something just because you made a mistake in basic math.
Well, it's interesting too, because with, people like talk about Common Core math, there's not so much controversy over it anymore. Either people gave up arguing or they now understand it better. But when a student does a performance task, if they get a performance task is like a real life application. It's more than a word problem though. It's like a series of 5 questions that they have to answer based on a certain set of information. So like it might be like, how much do tickets cost at a movie theater? And then they have to do different activities with them to show that they really understand the math.
Right.
If the student gets the wrong answer, yes, it counts against them, but it doesn't negate their entire score. So you don't fail a performance task because you subtracted incorrectly. You lose a little bit for having the wrong answer, but really the focus of the performance task is to see if they can reason in math. So yeah,
Do they understand how subtraction works?
Right.
And do they do that?
And not just that, but how they can put the numbers together and take them apart. Like for
Right.
example, using my movie theater ticket example, do they have the ability to figure out how much it's going to cost for grandma, mom and dad, and 3 kids to go see a movie at 8 o'clock? If they can do that, even if their answer is wrong, you can see that they know how to add, they know how to see that, grandma gets the senior price and all that kind of stuff, and they know how to do all that. So,
Right.
And that's kind of the difference between theology and like a catechism per se.
Right.
So, or discipleship. Baptists use discipleship. We don't call it catechism.
Yeah, it's essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
As we don't, as part of the low church, being Baptists, we claim that we don't have liturgies, but try doing the order of service on a Sunday morning different than what everybody expects, and people freak out.
Especially since my PowerPoint slides are set up based on what everyone has told me they're going to do.
Yes.
Although it has happened, I go flipping through slides. Usually it's my fault, but
yeah, but we do have liturgy. It's just that it's not this formalized thing that.
And it doesn't come down from the Southern Baptist Convention,
right?
And it's not based on the calendar.
Nothing comes down from the Southern Baptist.
Right.
That's one of the mistakes people make in thinking about Baptists, is that somehow there's this place somewhere that tells all the Baptists what to do. It doesn't work that way. All the little churches tell the place back there, this is what we want you to do. We're the boss, they're the follower.
Right, and a lot of the people, actually the bulk of the people in our church, this is the only church they've ever been a member of, and when our previous pastor retired, they were like, what do we do? Well, it was really just Robin and me and Kathy that knew what to do, because he had been in churches where they got a new pastor, and I was the kid of the new pastor, and Kathy had both of those experiences. So the three of us knew how it worked, but like in some things, like the Presbyterian church, they'll send you in, they'll just shift pastors around like school districts shift principals.
Right.
And you don't really get a choice in who your pastor is, I don't believe. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, not a whole lot.
But yeah, so.
Yeah, with the Baptist church, they are autonomous. Each Baptist church is an entity unto itself, and however they choose to run things is what they want to do.
Right. And I think depending on the
we're
brand.
Close to being anarchists.
The brand of Baptist,
that varies too.
Right. Well, there's the amount of control.
That's because Baptists don't get along with each other.
Yeah. But the brand will sometimes have some stipulations. Like I know, well, my parents aren't technically Baptist, but it's a Baptist-like denomination. They'll tell you it's not a denomination, but it is.
Yes.
But in the IFCA, if you don't hold to all of their tenets that they say are, this is what the IFCA is, you can't be an IFCA church. You would just be an independent church or a fundamental church.
Which
but
brings us to heresy. Yeah.
Right. So, but see, like we have the Baptist faith and message, but not everybody in our body agrees with all the things the Baptist faith and message.
Because as Baptists, one of the things that we don't like is the concept of a creed.
Right.
Because the way creeds work is, and like the statement of faith in IFCA and a lot of churches, if you don't hold to these things, then you are no longer part of the group. The problem being then, despite the fact they would say, what's the final authority for faith and practice in the church, they'd say the Bible. No, it's not. It's the statement of faith, or it's the creed.
David said Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah.
They're seriously heretical, and we can probably talk.
Yeah, we could
talk on them all day.
I would say that they're heretical, and I'll get to why primarily they're heretical. But anyway.
I do want to mention for people that are watching, and we do have some people watching, please feel free to ask questions, participate. I have my phone here if you're connected through my Facebook, and if you're connected through Robbins or through Mirror Darkly, you'll show up on the laptop. So if you see me going over like this, I'm responding to the laptop.
If you're going down here, then it's your phone.
I pick up my phone, so you'll see my, because I can't do anything from here on it. It'll fall down. But anyway, please feel free to participate in the discussion, because that's why we're here.
Yes.
We had another person join us, so I'll see who that is and I'll say hi to them.
Oh.
But anyway, so go on to the next point. I'll try to listen while I do it at the same time.
The difficulty is that in a lot of churches, the statement of faith or the creed or however they want to call it becomes the actual authority, and to divert from that authority then means that you're no longer in good standing, and they'll run you out of the church, or they'll put you into church discipline or whatever. Which makes for a very broad definition then of what heresy is, because every little point in those statements of faith then becomes something you absolutely have to hold to, or else you are no longer part of the group. In Baptists traditionally, and we don't really like tradition either, but traditionally we don't believe in a statement of faith, and so for instance, Southern Baptist Convention, we have what's called the Baptist Faith and Message, and what that is supposed to be, although too often in a lot of Southern Baptist churches it becomes a creed, but what it's supposed to be is a description rather than prescription. As it describes, if you were to get a group of Baptists together and have them vote on things, these are the things majority of them would agree with.
Which is really how they decided on it, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it was very
So
democratic.
so it's not supposed to be you have to believe these things. Just if you're wondering what Baptists are like, this is a pretty good picture of it.
Well, a good example.
But you don't have to believe those things in order
Right.
to be a Baptist.
A good example, a church that we were members of years ago and got married there, they were a Baptist church. Well, they have
They're
moved
not.
from congregational rule to elder rule, where there's a group of people that run everything, and that is a non-Baptist thing. So they are no longer a Baptist church, they're now a Bible church.
Yeah, they're totalitarian.
Yes.
Because that small group of people, they're not elected.
Uh-huh.
They have there's nothing you can do. They just decide this is what
And
it's
actually,
going to be.
in looking at their new constitution, their pastor isn't even a member of the elder board.
Right.
So the pastor has no say in how things are going either, which I find
Weird.
very odd, because, we always went to very small churches, so usually my dad was the pastor, elder board treasurer, chose and led the songs.
So being the
but-
treasurer and the pastor at the same time is a really bad
Well,
idea.
there was no money, so
Oh, so
he was
nothing to worry
really,
about.
he was kind of fishing in a dry lake bed, so.
okay.
But,
Those should always be
but there
kept
weren't enough people, so somebody had to do it, so it'd be him. But as to my knowledge, my dad always had a say. The only church he didn't was when he was interim pastor at the Brethren Church, because we weren't brethren, which he was glad, because they did foot washing, and my dad had really sensitive feet. His feet were like achy too, so you would not want to wash them. Even Jesus probably would have gone, can you scoot over there? I'll go on to the next guy. Actually, Jesus would have healed his feet first, but it's
Yes.
funny to think about. Jesus go up and go, ooh, let's heal these first. Okay, we're good.
But heresy, as I said, although historically it was primarily focused on the doctrine of God, doctrine of Christ, it has broadened to cover just about everything. And so if you don't agree on all little tiny details, then you can be labeled a heretic just for that.
Kind of like Facebook.
Yes. If you say the wrong thing, you're screwed.
Yeah, theology has become like Facebook.
Or politics.
Because on Facebook you're called a racist, and on biblical things you're called a heretic.
Yeah,
So.
it becomes almost meaningless in both cases. Overuse of the terms. But for instance, I've been called a heretic more than once. For instance, I wrote an article that was in the Jerusalem Post entitled "God Loves Gay People." And my argument was that Christianity has made the error once again of excluding certain people. That is, the persecution of Jewish people by Christians has made it very difficult to share the gospel with them. Because why would they want to listen to you if you're killing them? Your message is not particularly attractive then. And it's very difficult to witness to Muslims for the same reason, and now the church has made it very hard to share their faith with gay people for the same reason. And I talked about that, God loves sinners, and gay people are sinners just like anybody else. What's weird is if you specify a given sin, then somehow people get really unhappy with you.
Well, it's like saying in the
God loves
1950s,
porn.
God loves divorced people.
Yeah, or God loves porn
Yeah.
stars. There's a group that ministers to porn stars, and they wanted to have Bibles printed that had that on the cover, and the Bible publishing company said, no, we can't do that. That would be a horrible thing to do. That's blasphemous. I'm thinking if they put God loves sinners, nobody would have had any problem with it, but specify the sin. So anyway, and I had 1,500 negative comments about what I had written on the Jerusalem Post Facebook page. And I had one person that actually hunted me down and contacted me through every single social media contact possibility I had. They contacted me on Facebook, they contacted me through Twitter, they contacted me through all the email addresses I have, telling me that I was a horrible person, couldn't possibly be a Christian, and so on. I thought, well, that's interesting. Did another article on, which is part of the basics of Christianity, that is that we're saved by grace through faith, that it's not by works. And I had somebody claim that I couldn't possibly be a Christian for that. I guess because I wasn't preaching you have to do certain things in order to be
You have to be
acceptable.
good.
You have to be good.
Because otherwise, how else would you be good?
That's right.
Because that's the important thing.
That is the important thing, despite the fact that it's actually not the important thing. It's quite clear that being good was not the critical issue from God's perspective. Otherwise, Adam and Eve wouldn't have had the choice to.
David said hookers for Jesus. Now, David, was that a real thing? Or are you just...
It's possible.
I'm wondering if David
He's
knows.
just being funny.
Okay.
Probably.
So, yeah, hookers for Jesus.
yeah,
that won't be me. That's not my ministry area.
Anyway, and I was telling that, the church was not loving people by excluding gay people like they do. And people would argue with me and say, well, no, we love gay people. It's just that, we want to exclude them, kill them, whatever, but we love them. Mm-hmm. It's like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
It proved my point.
We're not supposed to introduce people to Jesus by actually sending them there.
Yes, apparently. But, I remember at the school that I taught at for 1 year, I was described as a tool of the devil because of my interpretation of Isaiah chapter 14 and Ezekiel 28, because I argued that neither of those passages have anything to do with Satan. One is talking about the king of Babylon, the other is talking about the king of Tyre. They are not describing the origin of the devil. Unless you want to ignore the context and just take 3 or 4 verses out of context and run with that. And so again, I'm a heretic because of that. I was a heretic for rejecting the concept of, what was it called? This went on my head. The age of accountability.
Oh.
That is, the idea that before a child turns a certain age, that they automatically have a get-out-of-hell-free card. Mm-hmm. Once they commit the unpardonable sin of turning 4, boy, they're going to hell. Mm-hmm. It's nonsense. But yet a lot of people seem to believe in the age of accountability, and if you point out problems with it theologically, you're going to be called a heretic.
Yes.
People who think that it's okay to speak in tongues will be called heretics by those who reject it, and vice versa. Arminians will call Calvinists heretics, and Calvinists will call Arminians heretics. If you reject the concept of the KJV, the King James Version of the Bible, being the only acceptable version, then you can oftentimes find yourself being called a heretic by those who believe so.
It is an actual thing. Hookers for Jesus. The guitar player of the band Stryper is married to the head of the organization. They are all former prostitutes.
Just like
interesting.
What's her name in the Bible? Oh, you have
Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, Mary Magdalene. Although you'll have people that are, Mary was not a prostitute, and blah blah blah. I had that issue with when I did my book, The Bible's Most Fascinating People. I had pointed that out, and then there's this odd New Testament scholar who berated me, that Reader's Digest had hired to look over my shoulder, who berated me on it, so I had to change things to make her happy. It's actually an issue of...
Was she just a customer service representative? I mean, what was her...
Well, no. The question is, Mary is a very common name in the Bible.
Okay.
And so the question then becomes, can you identify this Mary, this Mary, this Mary as all being the same Mary or not? And she was arguing not.
Okay.
I was thinking yes.
Okay.
But in order to make her happy and Reader's Digest happy, I had to make that adjustment. I didn't really care, so
okay,
go for it. But yes, there is a Mary in the Bible, Magdalene or not, who was a prostitute, follower of Jesus, so on.
Right.
Rahab in the Old Testament, she was a prostitute. You see that not infrequently. In fact, the whole idea of having your head covered, if you read 1 Corinthians, the reason Paul did that is because depending on whether you had your head covered or not, it identified you, your social status. That is, the prostitutes, I forget which way it was, didn't have their head covered, and then the high-class women did. And so you'd look at the congregation and say, okay, these people are prostitutes, these aren't. And so there'd be a difference of how you would treat people. And so Paul said everybody has to wear the head covering. The idea being then you wouldn't know and it didn't matter. Because, Paul's very explicit in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. He says, in Christ there's neither slave nor free, male nor female, Jew nor Gentile, we're all one in Christ. And so the idea is that we are all on an equal footing. Anyway, side note. So it's, you have an endless number of things that people can get all in the lather about regarding you're a heretic or not, depending on whether you believe a certain small item of theology. And it shouldn't be that way. That is, we should not exclude people based upon a difference of opinion on some aspect of what the Bible says that isn't that clear.
Well, there are so many reasons to
There's
really.
a lot of reasons to really hate people, yes, Emo Phillips.
This whole thing is reminding me of him, actually.
Yeah, well, that's the joke, and that's what happens. That is, that Emo Phillip joke, the truth behind it is that people will do that to people who have very tiny differences of opinion regarding things that really you can't come down firmly on anyway to begin with. And even if you can, you should be able to live with that difference. I like to point out to people that we are saved by grace alone, by faith alone, by Christ alone. We're not saved based on how well we know theology. In the book of Hebrews in chapter 11, you have a list of the great people of faith. And one of the interesting exercises to do, and I actually did this in a series of sermons for the church, is to look at what the lives of these people were actually like. And most of them were not upstanding citizens, shall we say. That is, they're just ordinary people with, oftentimes very serious issues and problems. One of the people that's listed there, and he's my favorite to point out, is one of the judges. His name is Jephthah. If you go back to the book of Judges and you find the story of Jephthah, you'll discover some interesting things about him. For one thing, he decides to sacrifice his daughter as a burnt offering, which is not really something that God would have been in favor of. We also find that he believed in the reality of other gods. He wrote a letter to the enemy of Israel at the time, and he pointed out to them, look, God gave us our land, your God gave you your land, stop bothering us. Monotheism is a fairly basic concept in theology, and yet Jephthah wasn't even clear on that. You talk about doctrine of God, doctrine of Christ as being central issues in whether it's heresy or not. Jephthah, for all practical purposes, was a heretic. He burned his daughter he killed his daughter as a burnt offering, and he believed in multiple gods. You can't really screw up a whole lot more than he did. And yet, he is listed as a person of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. So, arguing over whether or not superlapsarian or sublapsarianism is the way to go in understanding Calvinism is perhaps not an issue that really is of significance. Of course, I'd say both are nonsense because it fails to reckon with the fact that God is not a time-bound being. But anyway, because superlapsarianism, sublapsarianism has to do with the order of the decrees that God gave regarding redemption. Well, if God is not time-bound, then that kind of becomes moot, I would argue. Anyway, but then I'm a heretic as far as both Arminians and Calvinists would consider me a heretic because I'm neither. And a lot of Christians get puzzled by that as if those are the only two possibilities. Shows how much most people know. Now, in times past in the church, particularly in Europe, you will see heretics being executed. That is, the church would condemn a person of heresy and then turn them over to the state, who would then execute the individual because you didn't have a separation of church and state, which is itself another big problem, and we'll get to that too perhaps, since the state is run by the devil. Anyway, why would the church countenance the execution of people on differences of doctrine? Why does that seem like a good idea to the church for a very long time?
Well, because that's what people want to do. They want to get, I mean, you see it now with people getting doxxed and things like that.
Because they believe something.
Right, because you don't agree with them. Like that little girl.
But what motivates a person to do that? What is the fundamental reason for it?
Hatred.
Okay, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Okay, the reason that the church would want to execute a heretic is because they believe the heretic was endangering the souls of other people.
That they might drag other people away.
They might drag other people away from the faith.
Okay.
And so, if you think in terms of protecting the larger group, is which is better, that one should die for the nation or that the entire nation should die? The quote.
The good of the many outweighs the good of the few.
Right.
Or the one.
Yes. And so, in order to save the many, we will get rid of this one troublesome individual. And that was what motivated that attitude. And like you said, we see that reflected in society at large, because what people want to do, if somebody says something that they don't agree with, the tendency is we need to make that person shut up, we need to drown them out, we need to punch them in the face, whatever. That is a significant error. It is the best way to counter an idea is with other ideas. The best way to counter speech that you don't agree with is with more speech. It is, look again at the underlying, the subtitle of what we're doing today, unbridled inquiry. That is, you should not be controlling what people can and cannot say, what people can and cannot believe. You don't want to restrict that in any way. You want to counter what they're saying, counter what they're believing with other arguments, with other words. You don't react to it with violence. You don't react to it by making them shut up by force. You don't try to control what people say. Paul, in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, writes, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ." That is Paul's approach, and the approach that in a free democracy we should be taking anyway, is complete freedom of speech, complete freedom of thought, complete freedom of ideas, and freedom to exchange and say and think anything we want, because we believe that good speech will drive out the bad speech, that good arguments will win over bad arguments. It's not always going to happen, but it's better to allow that than the alternative.
Right.
That is, start killing people, punching people, doing acts of violence against those that you disagree with, trying to drown people out, trying to deplatform people. It's just not the proper way of handling things. That's the way the world would like to do it. That's why the world keeps doing that sort of thing. And if you look at the history of the world, that's the way it works. That is, governments try to restrict what people are allowed to say, restrict what they're allowed to believe, restrict what they're allowed to say, because that's the way the world works. As Christians, we should not be engaging in those kind of worldly activities.
And if you think about it, like obviously heretical religions, like the Church of Scientology, they do that. And so they, like if somebody wants to leave the church, they will make a website about all the horrible things this person's done, even if they have to make it up. And they'll put signs out in front of put signs in front of their house. Do you really want this person living in your neighborhood?
Right.
When they've obviously done these things? And then they reference their own website that they created against. They basically dox people is what they do.
Yes, that's what they do.
And
because that's the way the world likes to operate.
Right. And
we will make someone pay for the ideas that they hold. We'll make someone pay because they said something we disagree with.
Right.
As you have an idea we find abominable, and therefore we're going to make your life hell. And we will make it so that you can't have a job. We'll make it so that you end up on the street, living in the gutter. You know, you deserve whatever horrible thing happens to you because you said something or wrote something we don't like. That's horrible. This is why we have the First Amendment. It is freedom of speech, freedom of the press. The idea is that we don't try to restrict those sorts of things.
And I like too that in that scripture that you read, it said that what is about idea or
We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets us up against the knowledge of God. We take captive every
demolishing
thought.
arguments. That's attacking ideas with other ideas.
Right, not attacking people. See,
Right.
one of the other things that Paul talks about, he does, I think it's in Ephesians, he says that our enemies are not people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a mistake that is very commonly made, that
Right.
somehow people are our enemies. It's ideas.
Right. Well, and I was listening to a podcast today where he said there's 3 ways you know that you've won the debate, and one of them is when the person resorts to, well, you're just a racist, or you're just a this, you're just a that. It's like, well, thank you for surrendering to my argument. They're out of arguments, they just attack you as a
So they're
person.
name calling.
Yeah.
And see, that's
like
the
little
problem.
kids.
Yeah.
Well, you're stupid, and your mom, like, you know, your mom's fat, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's not a very good argument.
Yeah, it gets tiresome.
yeah.
One of the things that annoys me a lot with Facebook is that the arguments tend to be little pictures with words on them. And that really doesn't do a whole lot. I mean, it's nice that you're venting your spleen and you're, you know, getting the emotions out, whatever's bothering you, but, you know, this does not an argument make. And you need documentation, you need a reasoned argument. When I teach theology, what I'm trying to do with the students is to teach them how to think in a logical, reasonable, rational way. And when they, you know, if I ask them a question, I don't want them to say, well, you know, I believe this because you told me this, or I believe this because this popular pastor believes, or I believe this because whatever, or I disagree with you because you're a poopy head. None of those are reasonable arguments. I want to see a reasoned argument. I don't care if the student has an opinion or a point of view different than mine. I want them to be able to give me a reasoned argument. If they can do that, then they get full marks. That's what I'm looking for. I want people to know how to think, to know what they believe and why they believe it, and to be able to express that.
And that goes back to my performance task example.
Right.
Like your math was wrong, but your reasoning is correct.
Exactly.
You'll fail on the calculation part on the other part of the test. Right now we're testing your ability to think mathematically. And same thing with the language arts performance task. Can you write about your ideas even though they're not good ideas? You know, can you write about it and explain what you're thinking?
Right. Now, a third grader, you don't necessarily expect them to have wonderful ideas.
Right.
Well, it's like this stupid, I can't remember his name. Actually, I'm going to reference him in tomorrow's sermon, but I've got notes for that. But he wrote a book that became a bestseller. It was called Kiss Dating Goodbye. And he argued for, you know, courtship instead.
Oh.
He was 21 years old when he wrote that. He was unmarried. He didn't even have a girlfriend at the time. Why are you wanting to listen to this guy's advice? Why do you think he has great insights on dating and how it's supposed to work?
He's just looking for a way to get a girlfriend, and so
Yes.
far dating hasn't worked for him. So he's trying a different way.
He's trying a different way. Became a big popular thing. The whole purity movement grew out of it. This past week, he apologized for having written the book that he thought was legalistic. He has turned against Christianity. He's divorcing his wife of 21 years. I mean, everything is just, boom, fell apart.
Wow. And the Duggars' their whole show is built on the whole courtship idea.
Yeah, well, it goes back to that guy's book.
Wow. That's
as far
crazy.
As I know, I mean, there may have been other people that came to the same notion, but I think he was the source of it. But yeah, it's all...
Well, because people are always looking for the silver bullet that'll make their lives better.
Yeah, well, people imagine that somehow life can come down to this checklist. It's like Weight Watchers. Weight Watchers is popular because if you follow all these rules, then you get a certain result. And people like to think that that's the way life is going to work.
And even Weight Watchers
Guess what?
doesn't work
Life-
like that.
No, it
because
doesn't.
you'll hit a plateau or something, or you'll hit a rough spot in your life and you stop losing weight and you're like, wait, I've done all the things I've tracked all my food, I've eaten only 0-point foods, why am I not losing weight? So even though it's very effective and it's a healthy way to lose weight, it doesn't always work in the way you expect, because we want that thing that will make it work for us.
Yeah, well, that guy's book is, somebody described it, I can't remember, again, I think it's in my notes for tomorrow, described this as being a sexual prosperity gospel. That is, the idea is that if you do these things, then you will end up, in a wonderful relationship, and everything will be wonderful, and your life will be perfect, and blah, blah, blah. That is, it's like you're expecting, okay, God, I followed all the rules, I did everything you told me to do, why is my life going to hell in a handbasket? As if somehow that's the way it works. And see, that isn't the way it works, but that's the way we would like it to work. Thinking in terms of heresy, this is a very popular heresy, the idea
that... I feel really sad for him.
No, I do too,
really
but
do.
he made...
But he was young too, and we all do stupid things when we're young. We just don't do them on a grand scale like that.
Yeah, I mean, it was his first
like
book.
eating Tide Pods.
And the book sold millions of copies. He made a boatload off it. So I mean, from that standpoint, it was successful, I suppose. But yeah, it screwed over an awful lot of people. Again, thinking in terms of the nature of heresy. And why there are those who want to silence heretics is because they think, well, look at the damage that can be caused by somebody with a stupid idea. And it's true. Stupid ideas can cause really big repercussions. Think about Nazism. You have this very minor party in Germany that ends up becoming dominant, and look at the damage it did. Millions of people dead as a consequence of that. The question is, and this is something that we have to recognize as important, is that freedom is more important than controlling things.
And making people be
Making
good.
people be good. That is, going back to, if you look at Genesis chapter 1 through 3, with Adam and Eve, God put them in a perfect place, the environment couldn't have been better, and he gave them a choice. If God's concern was that they should always be good, he would not have given them the opportunity to make the wrong choice.
Right.
But he gave them that freedom. Freedom, from God's perspective, was of greater importance than being good. Giving Adam and Eve freedom was worth all the horrors that have happened in humanity ever since. And that's an interesting point of view, I suppose. But as members of Western civilization, particularly in the United States, we have decided, although there are people that would disagree with this still, that freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press is more important than making stupid people, bad people, be quiet. That we think it's better to argue against the stupid and bad ideas than it is to restrict them. Because if you look at those societies that do restrict them, they tend to have far worse problems. That is, ask yourself where you'd rather live, in a free society or in a totalitarian society. Is it more comfortable to live in, say, the United States, or would you rather live in Nazi Germany or communist Russia?
Or Venezuela.
I mean, the examples of non-free societies is endless. The examples of free societies is much smaller and have been around for a much shorter period of time, although the number of free societies has been growing. There are more free democratic societies now than ever. So.
Well, and two, even the countries that are not free are headed that direction.
One can hope.
Yeah. Well, China has dabbled in capitalism, and it's worked for them up until recently. But
yeah, they're having Hong Kong is causing them headaches.
Well, and so are we.
Of course, we would
tariffs.
except we that is, my thought was when mainland China swallowed Hong Kong when Britain gave it back to them in 1999, I thought of that as being a poison pill that's going to undermine their totalitarian society.
Like yeast in the loaf.
Yeah, I don't think that that's going to, I don't think they're going to be able to maintain their totalitarianism permanently any more than the Soviet Union was able to. Once you allow, that's what, that was Gorbachev's mistake. It is perestroika and what was the other term, that undid things.
Well, and I think even now with North Korea, with the little bit of contact that Kim Jong-un has had with Donald Trump, I think that eventually there's going to be
That's
that
the hope.
shift.
That's always the hope. The question is whether or not it's always, because the totalitarian society can, if they keep the clamps on, they can keep the clamps on for a long time. If they start letting clamps off, that's when you can have problems. And the question with, say, North Korea or with Iran is another example, is whether or not any of the clamps are coming loose. Just because Kim Jong-un has been exposed to the West doesn't mean that anybody else in his society has been.
Right.
Because he's got a pretty hard
Right,
clamp
but
in place.
he's opened a window for a little bit of a breeze, I think, with the whole crossing over the DMZ thing. I
You can
think it
see.
was an open window, and it may be a very, very, very long time. But I think that, I don't know, maybe I'm too optimistic.
Well,
but-
these little tiny countries like that, China I don't think is going to stay in the same situation. Right? The question with China is whether or not it's going to be a violent mess. What was
But look
fascinating
how long
about,
it's taken, though, because Nixon did the Trump thing in 1971, 2, was it? When did he?
Somewhere along in there.
Yeah, in the early 70s, and now we're like almost
that-
50 years later.
well, that ultimately led to, because of their exposure and more openness to the West, that's why they became more capitalist in their
Right, but that
economics.
was the window that
But
let the
that-
breeze in.
Yeah, but they are still a totalitarian society.
Right, and you saw that with Tiananmen Square.
Right.
And even now, on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, they never mention it. We talk about it,
Yeah.
but they
Well,
never
also you
mention
see what's
it.
going on with Hong Kong right now.
Right.
You've got violent protests and all sorts of issues. How that's going to work out is hard to predict.
Right,
Because the communist regime has pretty much absolute control over everything.
right. I still say, though, it's just a crack in the window
What
that is letting in a little bit of a cool breeze. And really, because of the sanctions
Yeah.
that are on North Korea right now, that could break the back, at least
Yeah.
economically.
Well, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book back at the time the Soviet Union collapsed called The End of History. And looking back on the book, it seems overly optimistic, although I still think there's something to say about his basic thesis, which is when you think in terms of Hegelian dialectics, you have an idea that comes along, and then you'll have an opposing idea, and then they come together, and that becomes a new idea, which will get an opposing idea, and so on, ad infinitum, forever. And he said in the book that when you think in terms of political systems, we have reached the end of history. That is the end of that dialectic. That is the only form of social organization that demonstrably works and now really has no viable alternative is Western liberal democratic society. That is what you see in Western Europe, United States, New Zealand, Australia, places like that. That kind of structure seems to be, there's no compelling
And Denmark and Norway, incidentally,
I said
they're
Western Europe.
Right, I know, but people want to say that Denmark and Norway are socialist. They're not. They're just they're a welfare state, but they're
But
democratic.
anyway, that is, you had up until the end of the Cold War, communism as an alternate form of doing things. Going back to the 1920s and 30s, fascism was also part of the mix. It had fascism, democracy, and communism. Who's going to win out? Now with the collapse of the Soviet Union, is there anything else that is, you have Islamism as an opponent, but is anybody in the West seriously attracted to living in a country like Saudi Arabia or Iran? Probably not. You don't have a whole lot of people. You do have some extremists, neo-Nazis and whatever, that still like the idea of fascism. There's still communist parties. But again, the bulk of humanity is not interested in those things because they didn't work. There's nobody, you do have weird people who say, this time for sure we can make communism work. You don't have anybody saying this time for sure we can make Nazism work. Communism is no better than Nazism. It's just as stupid and horrible and totalitarian and restrictive as Nazism is. But anyway, the answer to heresy, going back to what we were talking about today, and we're almost out of time, is not to shut down the heretics, make the heretics shut up and be quiet and go away. The way you respond to heresy is through argument, through ideas, through more speech. That is, you don't restrict speech, you have more speech. You don't restrict publishing, you have more publishing. You don't restrict ideas, you have more ideas. And for a lot of people, that seems very counterintuitive. That somehow the only way to counter a bad idea is to make them shut up. No.
Right.
Or the only way to counter a bad idea is to shout louder and keep people from being able to hear them. Again, it doesn't work that way. You have to have the arguments. You have to confront and have rational arguments against it.
Yeah, the problem is people don't feel comfortable doing that, and they don't feel like they have enough knowledge
and
to do
there's
that. And that's where I end up, and then I get mad.
Well, that's why people then shout names at one another, because they can't figure out how to argue, and so they'll just yell and scream at each other and say, you're a poopy head.
I just stop talking when I run out of arguments.
Yeah, it's just,
okay, so David said that he was branded a heretic when he got dismissed from the Catholic Church after becoming a Christian. And he said, we need to remember that we are not a pure democratic nation, but a republic. That is true.
True. Well, it's a, yeah.
The Founding Fathers did that because they knew that a true democracy wouldn't work over time.
Well, the problem with if it's a complete and absolute democracy, then you end up with one, like classic example is you have, sheep and wolves voting on what we're going to have for dinner.
I think
the
sheep will end up being
the majority rule in that case is not necessarily being good. So that's why you have, like the Constitution, where you have limitations placed on what the government can do and restrictions on what can be regulated. And so speech and religion and assembly and the press are not supposed to be regulated.
Right.
And so that's what makes us not a completely pure democracy, because we do have restrictions and guidelines about how things are going to be.
Well, and in the republic part of it, there's even limitations because there's like senators are like every state has the same amount of senators, but then representatives. Am I right on this?
Yes.
Okay, representatives are different. Yeah, because that's based on population, and then the representatives only serve for a short time, and the senators serve for a long time.
Originally, the senators were appointed by the state legislatures, and so they were not actually elected by anybody.
Oh, okay.
That is, you would have the state legislature who had been elected. They would make the determination of who was going to be the senators, while the representatives were elected by the people in the area. And so again, you have, and of course, thinking in terms of the three branches of government, we split up the government in three parts. They'll have to argue with each other. As the fact that the government can't get a whole lot done is a feature, not a bug.
Right. Well, and it's really an ingenious system if you think about it. And they were all sweating in Philadelphia trying to figure all this out. And if you watch the movie 1776, although it's a dramatization, I'm sure it's like hugely inaccurate about certain things.
Now, if you want a
but
more
it really
accurate view, Miracle in Philadelphia is a good book to read.
But the just watching them argue and being mad at each other and Ben Franklin not talking to anybody, and he was like, you know, it's a pretty cool. We got to see it in the movie theater in high school. It was like our senior trip or something. In Lake Havasu, there wasn't much to do, so our senior trip was to go to. I think it was senior trip. We went to see 1776, but anyway. It gives you a feel for what it was like in Independence Hall at that time, trying to argue all this stuff out. And I cannot imagine being dressed in those outfits with the powdered wigs on and
no air conditioning.
No air conditioning, and you open up the window and it's like boiling hot and humid. Everywhere back east is just so humid, and it was hot. And they open up the window and there is no breeze. And and to think that they came up with this ingenious plan that has lasted for so many years.
They were drinking heavily at the time too.
Well, that's the only way to survive. But I don't think water was
That's not what they were drinking.
No, I was saying water I don't think was a really good option at that time, was it?
Well, you have to be real careful.
Yeah. So beer and wine is safer because it's processed.
Yeah, one of the funny things, and we'll have to end on this, we're at 5 o'clock now, is go back, you can find it on the web, a list of all the stuff that they consumed during their time there.
Oh.
You wonder how they could even walk.
Well, a lot of them didn't. They leaned on, you can see in the art, they were leaning on tables. It's because, he said, John Adams' miniseries was very
Yeah,
good.
it is
Watched
very
it in my
good.
political science class. See, I think we watched that together, didn't we? The John Adams
Maybe
miniseries?
I think it's either on Amazon Prime or Netflix you can get it. At least you
Okay.
used to be able to watch it on either of those.
so.
So yeah, it's very well done.
Yeah. So,
Okay, well we should end.
yes.
So go ahead and give the
Okay, so Amira Darkly, Unbridled Inquiry is brought to you by Quartz Hill School of Theology and Quartz Hill Community Church. And if you are interested in learning more in the area of theology and the Bible, we have classes online at theology.edu. You can take them for credit if you want. You pay a nominal fee. But if you just want to learn stuff, you can just take the classes online for free. Everything's there. We do classes in person as well if you're in the area. Quartz Hill Community Church is located in Quartz Hill, California. So if you live in the area and you're looking for a place to worship, if you're already at a place of worship and you're happy there, stay. We're not looking for to pull sheep from other folds. But if you're looking for a place to worship, try us out. We're at 51st and K, 51st Street West and K in Quartz Hill. Sunday school's at 10 and morning worship is at 11. We also live stream our church services. So if you are not in church at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings, Pacific time, and you want to catch service, you get everything. You get the worship, you get the announcements, the whole 9 yards. And if you remember to stop the feed, you won't get just a blank screen with the Quartz Hill Community Church on it. I turned the sound off last week and forgot to end the feed, so it's probably like a half an hour of just empty airtime on there. But once the service goes away, you're welcome to log out. But anyway, so we'd invite you to join us, and so we're here every week at about 4. We've been really good about being punctual.
Yeah, we've done very well on that.
Also,
So if you
invite your
happen to be
friends.
in the area and you want to participate,
Yes.
that is to come here into the studio and be with us, that would be good too.
This is not like Regis and Kathy Lee here. We
No.
bring other people in.
Yes.
To really
Discussion.
date myself, I don't even know who does that show
I have
anymore.
no idea.
It's that chick that used to be in a soap opera. And then there was that guy with the lisp that he's gone on to work for some news now, and
Oh.
she has some other guy. I think it's a guy that's on there, but
I
I
have no
don't
idea.
know their names because I don't watch those shows. But anyway, so but join us next week. We'd love to have you ask questions, give comments. David said bye, guys, and I guess that's my clue. I'm talking too long. Okay, see you next week.
Bye.